Welcome friends. Today I'll be talking about the concept of the public sphere. You might have heard of this term. It's a very important concept to understand how public opinion is formed. In short, this is an arena where private individuals come together and have a reasoned discussion on matters of mutual interest, and the best opinion wins. So let's start a discussion about the public sphere. Now, this concept of public sphere was introduced by the German sociologist Jürgen Habermas in the 1960s. He'd published this book called The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere in 1962. But this was translated into English only in 1989. And since then, the book has had an immense impact not only in Germany, but in the entire academic field and in the media as well. So before I start talking about the concept of the bourgeois public sphere as Jürgen Habermas conceptualized it, let's talk about the feudal public sphere which was there before the 18th and the 19th century. So the feudal public sphere was a staged and managed public sphere. So it was a place where the rulers and the aristocrats were recognized as rightful rulers. So a place, it could be a public platform or any place where the rulers and the aristocrats, they would present themselves and they would establish themselves as the rightful rulers of that particular place. And as you can understand, the public had a very limited role to play in this feudal public sphere. It was staged and it was managed. Staged in the sense that whether it was music or whether it was the costumes or the way people were seated or way the rulers were kind of hailed in the public, this was something which was staged and it was managed. And the citizens were passive consumers of infotainment. It was not just information, but as I said, in entertainment also in terms of music and dance and such things. So the role of the citizens was not to participate in anything, but to be passive observers and just to acclaim or just to applaud the ruling elite's decision. So that is how the feudal public sphere was, which was staged, which was managed, and where the citizens did not have a strong active role. The concept of bourgeois public sphere, I will have a detailed discussion in that in a moment's time. It relies on the distinction between the private and the public. So there is the private arena, which is the arena of the family where the autonomous family, they make their decisions, so on and so forth. And then there is the market or the public or the state sphere. So the public sphere conceptualized by Habermas lies between this private sphere on one hand and between the state or the market sphere on the other hand. So it opposes the state and it also works as a check on government. So when there are certain government decisions that people do not like, then this public sphere acts as a check on the government. So it basically takes care of the interests of the people in the society against the particular interests of the rulers. So the rulers, they have their interests. So we have a public sphere which is different from that ruler's sphere, and where people get together and they put a kind of a check on some of the decisions of the government that they do not like. So this bourgeois public sphere, as we will see, emerged hand in hand with the advent of capitalism from the 17th century onwards at different places in different countries. Basically, it came together in the European context where the conditions of capitalism allowed private individuals to get together to have certain decisions or certain information which they required. So the social conditions basically in Germany and in France and in Britain in the late 18th and the early 19th century facilitated a situation in which a large number of private middle class men or private individuals, they came together to engage in a reasoned argument over key issues of mutual interest and concern. I repeat, private individuals came together to engage in a reasoned argument over key issues of mutual interest and concern. And this created a space in which both new ideas and the discipline of rational public debate were cultivated. So all the new ideas that people would have would come out in these discussions, and the idea of a rational public debate. Debate which is rational, based on arguments and reason, and it is public, it's for everyone to consume and for everyone to participate. So these conditions of capitalism in this late 18th and 19th century in Germany, Britain and France created this kind of a situation where this rational public debate was possible. So at the beginning of this 18th century, the establishment of civil rights guaranteeing the individual freedoms of association and expression, it emerged. And along with that emerged the idea of a free press. So because people wanted information, people needed to get together to get information which affected them. So it gave rise to the emergence of a free press. It gave rise to physical spaces like coffee houses and salons, and also literary journals in which citizens could enter in free public discussion. So whether it was the literary journals or whether it was the coffee houses or whether it was the salons, it was the physical space where private individuals could come together and indulge in a rational public discussion. So as we can understand, the concept of early capitalism, it allowed people to get together, or it allowed these physical spaces to grow. So this was also because traders became more independent and started to trade between towns and beyond. So the traders had to go beyond a town. And so what this required was some kind of a regulation that was uniform or predictable for everybody. So if a trader from one city went to another city, he would have to face the same kind of regulation or same kind of taxes or the same kind of exchange and all. So that required people to get together, or that required some kind of a common law among these different kind of towns. So we can see that this new trade capitalism, this required uniformity in laws and in tax matters, so that they could act under conditions that were predictable. And this is what led to all these, salons and coffee houses and literary journals, or even the space in the press, which allowed them to engage in these discussions and debates, which was good for their trade, or which was in mutual interest. It was not in particular interest, it was in the mutual interest of everybody who were there in that particular trade. So along with this came the concept of newsletters, because with the growth in trade and this production, there came, as I said, a need for reliability and a need for predictable information. In short, for news. So because this information was required, people started producing newsletters. And this news was, as you can understand, was more about infrastructure, about what needed to be traded, about prices, about taxes and such things. So that's how the concept of newsletters began. So an important thing here was this fora was where people came together voluntarily and they participated as equals in public debate. So there was no high-low, there was no superior or inferior, everybody was there equal, and their participation was voluntary. Also, these arenas or these spaces, they were autonomous. So participation in them was voluntary, and they were independent of the economic and the political systems. So these spaces, they were not ruled by the economic systems or the political systems. They were free from any influence of the political class or even the economic class. So that was a very important distinction of this particular arena from the feudal public sphere, for example, where it was voluntary and autonomous. So that's how, private citizens united in a common aim to make use of their own reason in an unconstrained discussion between equals. So there was no constraint. I could come out with my opinion. Whatever I thought was in mutual was for mutual good, I could come out with my opinion. And this discussion is what was important. So this space was created which allowed individuals to express their views openly without any constraints. And soon a shared culture developed that helped participants discover and express their needs and interests, and also to define what was in the common good. So it was not about individual goods, it was about common goods. And an idea of what is public opinion, it crystallized or it revolved around this idea of common good. So something which was in common good was required for everybody, and that is how opinion was formed, and that is how people could get together and get new ideas or find out what was good for everybody. And this kind of a debate, as we can understand, is the true essence of democracy. And media had a very important role to play, because media provided that platform where people could have these different opinions and find out what opinion was good for everybody. And that is a very important concept here. So we've had some bit of discussion here. Now time for a very simple question. So quiz time. So the question is, the place where the rulers and the aristocrats were recognized as the rightful rulers is A, a modern public sphere, is B, a private public sphere, is C, a feudal public sphere, or D, it's a bourgeois public sphere? If you said feudal public sphere, you are right. So very important to understand the distinction between the private sphere and the state or the market. So there is the private sphere within the family, where we talk about things which is good for the family or which is good for the individuals in the family. And then there is the state or the market, which is the official government space. It could be the police, the courts, the authority, and the markets, and so on and so forth. The public sphere is a space between these two spaces, the private sphere on the one hand and the state and the market on the other hand. And that's a very important distinction to understand, that when we get into a public debate, I'm not talking only about what is good for my family, but I'm talking about what is the common good. And also, I'm not just trying to defend what the government is doing or not doing, because that is a separate sphere. I'm separate from the government as well. I'm separate from the state or the market as well. So I'm only talking about what is the common good. And that is such a beautiful argument, as you can understand. So as the authority and influence of the public spread, public opinion began to function as a check on the legitimacy of the powers of the unrepresentative government in these 18th and 19th century, because as you can understand, many of those countries, or many countries at that point of time, they did not have a true democracy where the rulers were representative of the public. So much of this government was unrepresentative government. And that's where this idea of public opinion, or this opinion which emerged from these coffee houses, from these salons, from these newsletters, from these literary journals, that is what acted as a check on the legitimacy of the government, or whether certain rules and regulations, they were in public interest, they would get support of the public opinion. If they were not in the public interest, or if they were not for the common good, they would not get the support of the public opinion. So that's a very important role of public opinion, and these rational discussions that happened in these public spaces. So according to Jürgen Habermas, the ideas of the Enlightenment, which is liberty, solidarity, and equality. So these important concepts of liberty, which is about freedom, as you can understand, about solidarity among individuals, and the concept of equality, that everybody is equal. This is inherent in the concept of public sphere, because this is about common good. This is about private individuals getting together and discussing what is in the common good. So the concept of solidarity and also equality, because there was no high, there was no low. It was just the strength of the argument that was important. So that's a very important concept, or that is a very important inherent characteristic of the Habermasian public sphere. So it's important just to repeat, the bourgeois public sphere emerged with capitalism, and it emerged with the new class of capitalist traders and producers. Second important thing, it was distinguished from the sphere of the market and from the sphere of the intimate family. And its institutional basis was in the press and the coffee houses. So press was a physical space where different where different kinds of opinion about the common good was debated, and the best opinion would flourish, or the best opinion would be accepted. And also in coffee houses where people would sit together, have those discussions which was in the common good, and that's how public opinion emerged. So the public sphere was seen as not only a check on the government, but it was the rational basis for government, because government exists for the people. The government has to exist for the welfare of the people. So the judgment of people themselves, or the judgment of private individuals getting together as the public and using their own reason and using their own rational debate, this became the source of legitimacy in society. So the public sphere was not only about a check on the government, but the rational basis of government itself. And that is why this concept is such an important concept. So before so this concept existed in the 18th and the 19th century, but beginning in the 1870s, the rise of the modern welfare state, according to Habermas, causes the division between the state and the civil society to break down, because the government started acting for public good. And that is where the division between the government itself and the civil society would break down. At the same time, private organizations also assumed public power. So this was about the societalization of the state. So a private individual could also become powerful. And the state itself, as I said, in a welfare society, penetrated the private realm. Not to suggest that this is bad, but this is just to reflect what is happening. So the state intervening for the welfare of the people, and the people themselves becoming important, or the people themselves becoming important in the government. So we had the societalization of the state, where the state is working for the society, and the statification of society, because these private individuals get to enjoy power. So this distinction, which was so important between the private sphere and the state sphere, this distinction was demolished, and that is what led to the disintegration of the public sphere. So debates in public sphere now was about whose interests would prevail in public policy. It was not about the common interest, but about group interest. So if a particular group was in power, they would want their interest to prevail in public policy. So what used to be that rational critical debate actually became a site for negotiation of interests. It was no longer about debate over what is in public good, or about whether it is rationally correct, but about whether I am representing a particular interest and whether that interest wins or does not win. So it was about different groups getting together and trying to negotiate for the best possible thing for their particular group. It was no longer a common group, because say for example, group A was in power, they would want good for people who were in group A, and people in group B, they would want to become powerful so that they could work for the interest of that particular group. So there was a shift from a universal disinterest to negotiation of particular interest, negotiations of interests which are good for a particular group. So we have had quite a dense discussion. Time for a quick quiz. This is a simple one. So public sphere is A, same as private sphere; B, same as state sphere; C, same as feudal public sphere; D, between private and state sphere. And I'm sure you know the answer is D, between private and the state sphere. So we'll talk about the concept of the re-feudalization of the public sphere. If you remember, I started off with a discussion of the feudal public sphere, whose actual interest or whose objective was to acclaim the people in power, or just to claim the authority or applaud the authority of those in power. So what has happened in recent times is that the producers of information and opinion are divided from the consumers of information and opinion. In an actual public sphere, they are all the same. People who produce information also consume information from others. But this division has been created. And the public sphere functions only to acclaim the authority of particular opinion or particular pieces of information. And that's where the concept of re-feudalization comes in. which is more a one-way communication rather than a dialogue. It's no longer a dialogue. We have people speaking about their what they're doing or not doing to the people and not indulging in a feedback from the public, as we know. So the politicians, the state representatives and corporations, they use the public sphere as a means to generate legitimacy for their interests and policies. So when a politician comes and talks on television or uses the newspaper to kind of talk about his opinions, etc., he just wants to generate legitimacy for their interest and policy, for his interest and policies. They represent themselves before the public. They are not there to kind of indulge in a debate with the public, but just to represent themselves in public. So with the help of the huge public relations machinery, politicians and corporations, they try to present themselves and events in a particular light so that they can garner legitimacy for their cause. So in short, public opinion is sought to be managed. It is no longer a public, but in many senses a non-public, because the audience has decomposed and there is no common interest. So that's an important discussion. The participation in the public sphere or in the bourgeois public sphere of the 18th century, coffee houses and salons and literary journals, it was restricted to a small group of educated men who had property. So this was very exclusive. Property and education were two unspoken conditions of participation. The majority of poor and uneducated people and almost all women were always excluded. So the idea of the Habermasian public sphere was almost very utopian. But an important thing to understand here is the notion of the common good or the common interest. So that was important for the bourgeois public sphere. But as we've just discussed, this notion of common good and common interest, it gave way to interest of small groups of educated men, and it was about their interest, and that was sought to be passed off as the interest of everyone. So as newspapers and magazines gradually acquired a mass circulation, they started going across the country, they started reaching out to all the nook and corner of the society, it gained a lot of power. And along with that, they got absorbed in the interests of the giant corporations. And those giant corporations often operated in private interests of a few powerful individuals. And that's where the decline of the public sphere started. So public opinion lost its dual autonomy, and it also lost its critical function, which was about creation of a rational public opinion and a reliable belief. So that was lost. So the public sphere in the 19th and 20th centuries became an arena in which public opinion could be stage managed and manipulated. So the mass media became consumer items, which instead of promoting freedom and human good, it began to stifle freedom in certain aspects, according to Habermasian theorists. So state and the state institutions, the economic institutions and the political institutions, they became more skilled at winning public acclamation and support. So all the institutions, all they needed was public support for their views, not to take in views from others, but just to establish their own legitimacy. So this was an important step in the degradation of the public sphere. So one critique is that Habermas treats society and the public sphere as totalities. We know that there can be individual differences. There can be many sphericals, for example. Secondly, the concept of Habermasian public sphere ignores the differentiations and the divisions within society and also within the public sphere. And the consequence is that the state of the public sphere is judged on the basis of one public sphere. Actually, there could be many public spheres, but we are kind of privileging one public sphere over others, and that is one of the critiques of the concept of public sphere. Later, Habermas revised his view of the public sphere by accepting that there is not one public sphere, but many overlapping and conflicting public spheres. And he speaks of the pluralization of public sphere and competing public sphere as well. There is also a critique of the media, in terms of public sphere. So the world fashioned by the mass media is a public sphere in appearance only. So we assume that it represents all different opinions, but it is only in appearance. So Habermas criticizes media on two counts. First, he criticizes media which he says are appropriate for consumption and leisureliness. They are not for a democratic opinion formation. So people use media for leisure and they use it for consuming those events and issues which the media comes out with. Secondly, they are more prone to manipulation and they reduce the faculty for a rational critical debate. So according to Habermas, this depoliticized media produces a depoliticized public, and which is bad for deliberative democracy. So with this we come to the end of today's discussion. Time for quiz 3. Advertising leads to A, strengthening of public sphere, B, strengthening of private sphere, C, decline of private sphere, and D, decline of public sphere. I'm sure you know the answer is decline of public sphere. Thank you very much.